metal under my boots rang like a church bell, though the night air lay dead and cold. Up on the truss, the fog pressed against my face, tasting of river rust. Hank's flashlight shook, beams sliding over bolts and cables, and then stopped on two round points of red, steady as brake lamps, set in a black shape crouched above the roadway. Men have asked me, years on, to set down what happened near Point Pleasant, and I did so with reluctance. If this account held you, like the video, subscribe for more, and comment below with your own recollections. It began 3 weeks earlier, on November 24, 1966, when my editor in Huntington sent me up Route 62 to see what the wire services called a bird with red eyes. I brought my Rolleiflex, a spare flashbulb, and a reel recorder that ate batteries. Hank Waller drove our Ford wagon, nursing its heater. Dr. Martin Klein from Marshall rode beside me, notebook on his knee. In Point Pleasant, the Ohio River ran high, and every diner table carried the same low talk. Something had been seen near the old TNT works after dark, and men did not laugh. We took rooms at the Low Hotel, sign flickering in the drizzle. Ruth Madsen, a school teacher who knew every back road, met us in the lobby with a county map and a tin of peppermints. Hank rolled a cigarette and offered me his pouch. We smoked on the porch and watched the bridge lights blink toward Gallipolis. Klein spoke of owls, of sandhill cranes blown off course, and he wrote their ranges as though ink could fence the unknown. Ruth said only, "My mother keeps the radio on now." I thought of my own wife and mailed her a postcard. On November 25th, we drove out to the abandoned munitions plant, its concrete igloos half swallowed by sumac and briar. The air held that wet coal smell that clung to the valley. Somewhere beyond the ponds, a call rose, 3 notes, then another, as if answered from a different throat. Klein paused, head tilted, and said it might be a heron. Still, the woods fell quiet afterward, even the crows. Near one bunker door we found prints in the mud, long as my hand, set too deep for a bird, leading to water and stopping as if the ground sealed. That evening, in a tavern off Main Street, we listened to men from the plant and the river talk over their beers. One claimed his hound refused to leave the porch, ears flat, eyes fixed on nothing. Another swore his cattle bunched against the fence before dawn, breathing hard. Hank laughed and asked why no one had shot it. The room went stiff. Ruth leaned close and said, "Folks here do not hunt what they cannot name." When we stepped outside, the temperature felt 10 degrees lower than the weather report, and the street seemed to wait for us alone. On the 26th, we returned with a tape measure, field glasses, and a lantern Hank had borrowed from his uncle. The pond edge showed a drag mark through cattails, and the cattails were snapped as though a heavy body had pushed through without care. We found a strip of burlap torn from one of the old storage sacks, neatly sliced, not ripped, and hung on a nail like a marker. Klein said boys might have done it. Ruth did not answer. As we worked, the wind died, and a smell like feathers mixed with something sour drifted down the channel. We decided on a watch that night. Hank parked the wagon near the North Powerhouse, with its bricks black with rain, and we sat with windows cracked, breath fogging the glass. My recorder hissed in the cup of my hands. Across the ponds came a metallic clink, like a tool dropped, then a pause, then 2 clinks, as if a mind tested our attention. Hank reached for his flashlight and froze. The sound came again, closer, and then stopped. The frogs had ceased at the first clink. When I rewound the tape later, the pauses were regular, almost measured there. On November 27th, Ruth brought us to the riverbank below the Silver Bridge, where the pilings rose from a boil of current. A grey fog lay low. Under the approach span, we saw fresh scratches on the steel, deep, parallel, too wide for a man with a knife. Klein ran his fingers along them and said they looked like talons, then shook his head, annoyed at himself. A farm dog that had followed us began to whine and would not go under the span. Hank lit another cigarette, and the match flame bent sideways as if pulled toward the water. By the end of that week, our notes had stopped sounding like a natural history list and begun to read like a warning. Klein wanted to leave, saying we chased a rumor in bad weather. Hank said we had come for pictures and would get them. Ruth moved between us, packing sandwiches and keeping a thermos of coffee. On November 29th, Deputy Orville Spence met us outside the courthouse. When I mentioned the prints and the scratches, he looked toward the bridge and said, "Keep to daylight." His hand hovered near his revolver. He spoke as if someone listened nearby. We went back to the TNT area on the night of November 30th, the moon thin as a clipped nail, and the wagon headlights picked out the bunker mouths like blind faces. We set the recorder on the dash and tuned the radio to WSAZ for time checks. At 11:17, the signal faded into a warble, then died, though the light still glowed. Hank tapped the set, cursed, and the engine sputtered as if it had swallowed water. In the same instant, something heavy struck the roof once. Not a branch, a deliberate thump that dented the metal above my head. Hank threw the door open with his flashlight up, and the beam caught only drifting mist and the shine of bronze. Another thump came back on the trunk, and something scraped along the roofline, a sound like a shovel on slate. Klein whispered, "Bird," but his voice broke on the word. Ruth stayed in the back seat, hands tight around her rosary. The air around the wagon turned cold, so cold my teeth ached. Then, from the dark between two bunkers, two red points rose and held steady at the height of a man's chest. They did not blink once. Hank did not wait for agreement. He slammed his door and turned the key until the starter caught. The wagon lurched, wheels spinning in mud, and we bounced down the service road. In the rear window, I saw the red points move with us, smooth, not bobbing, and a broader shadow flowed above the headlamps like a mantle. Klein shouted for me to photograph it, but my hands shook to fit the flash. At the gate, the speedometer read 80, and still the shadows stayed near, silent. When we reached a lamp by the bridge, it fell away into fog. In daylight, the wagon roof showed a fresh dent the size of a soup bowl rimmed with scraped paint. No branch overhung the road where we had parked. Klein examined the dent. He rubbed his thumb over the mark and fell silent. We took the recorder to our room and played the last minute. Under the thump, there was a faint rushing, like cloth pulled tight, and then a click as though something struck the microphone. Ruth asked us to leave town. Hank drove to Deputy Spence. The deputy listened and wrote nothing down. He said the river made imagine things. December came in with hard rain and headlines. The Point Pleasant Register carried new reports each day, and clippings slid under our door. 2 couples had seen the thing by the TNT gates, and their story matched ours in the one detail no one forgot: the eyes. Klein argued that headlights could redden a deer's gaze, yet he could not explain the height. On December 2nd, we walked the river road at dawn. A flock of starlings lifted, and then wheeled away from the bridge as if pushed. Under the girders, a musky odour hung, warm against the cold all morning. Ruth persuaded Deputy Spence to show us the riverbank at low water. On December 4th, the level dropped enough to bear a strip of sand and clay below the bridge. In a curve sheltered from the current lay 3 impressions like great souls, each with a narrow heel and a long toe spread. They ran toward the pier, then ended at the wet edge as if the maker had stepped into the river. Klein measured them twice and wrote the figures. A band of fog slid over the sandbar, and the air inside it felt warmer, close, as though exhaled. After that, Spence told us he could not spare a man for us. We began to work alone. Hank borrowed a surplus canvas tent, and we pitched it in scrub on the West Virginia side, not far from the bridge. The night of December 6th brought a wind that turned the trees into a moan. Near midnight, cars on the bridge seemed to hesitate, brake lights flaring. A barn owl hooted once, and then went silent. In the morning, our tent ropes were cut clean through, and 3 deep punctures marked the wagon hood, evenly spaced like a tool mark. Klein reached his end on December 7th. He packed his notebook and said he would take the bus. Hank called him coward. Klein answered that he preferred to be alive and wrong, then left at dawn. Ruth and I stayed. That evening, we walked the bridge approach on foot, counting lampposts for an angle. Halfway out, the air turned colder, and a smell of dead leaves and stale meat rose from below. The traffic noise dulled, as though cotton filled my ears. Above the roadway, on a crossbeam, something shifted and settled, larger than any bird, and the girder shivered. We went back to camp with our collars raised. Hank cleaned his hunting rifle by lantern light, though he had brought it only for comfort. Ruth telephoned her mother from a pay booth and returned pale, saying the line had clicked and breathed. At 2:00 a.m., the bridge lights went out, then returned one by one. Hank said it was the power company. Yet the river below had taken on a faint, milky band that moved against the current. When a car crossed, the tires sounded muffled, as if the deck were covered in felt, and my stomach tightened then. On December 9th, near midnight, we heard a sound unlike any wing beat, more like a sail snapping in wind. It came from above the tent and passed toward the river with a long hush. Hank fired once into the air. The hush returned, circling, and the ground seemed to vibrate through my knees. When I raised my camera, the viewfinder filled with darkness, then a brief glint of red. The flashbulb fired and showed only mist. At dawn, fish lay scattered along the bank, their eyes dried white as if dropped from height. Ruth would not eat after that. By December 14th, we had slept little and argued over every task. Hank wanted one photograph, and I wanted to go home. Ruth said we would regret leaving without knowing. At dusk, Deputy Spence warned us about boys climbing the bridge truss and said the river took what it chose. After supper, we walked the river road. Fog came early and clung to the steel like breath on glass. At 10:30, cars crossed toward Ohio, and above them, on the upper chord, a bulk shifted against the clouds. Hank said, "There," and put his gloves in my hands. And we climbed. Up there, my boots rang on the lattice, each step passing into my bones. Fog pressed against my cheeks and tasted of rust off the river. Hank's flashlight trembled, then pinned 2 red points, steady as lamps, set in a black mass crouched above the roadway. Wings lay folded like soaked canvas, span reaching from girder to girder. I brought up my Rolleiflex and the advance lever jammed. Hank whispered, "Caleb," and I heard his teeth click. The creature turned its head without shifting, and a musky warmth rolled over us like breath from a furnace. Below, traffic rolled on. I snapped one frame, but the shutter only clacked as if the film had not advanced. Hank raised the light, and the beam showed a hide that looked neither feather nor fur, but matte and pleated. The red point seemed to look through us. Hank lifted his rifle, and I caught his sleeve. The creature unfolded. Wings opened without sound. Mist peeled. A downdraft struck my face, hot and foul, and Hank slipped for a breath. The bridge trembled. The shape dropped from the cord and glided out over the Ohio, low and eyes burning until the fog swallowed them. We climbed down with our hands numb. On the gravel, Hank retched and wiped his mouth. Ruth said nothing, but her rosary beads had cut red marks into her palm. We broke camp before dawn and drove east without talk. Once our headlights caught a shadow crossing high above the trees, keeping pace for a mile. At a service station beyond Mason, I telephoned my editor. He told us to bring the film to Charleston. In Huntington, the newsroom laughed until they saw the dented roof and the holes in the hood, and then the laughter thinned into uneasy silence. Spence took our statements in a back office away from typewriters. He asked for times and distances, and he never used the word monster. The developed film showed only steel and fog. The crucial frame held a smear where the flash had bloomed. My article ran with cautious language and Klein's doubts. Privately, I wrote a fuller account and sealed it with a tape reel. Hank refused to be named and quit answering my calls. Ruth returned to her classroom and kept her rosary in her desk. I went to assignments, yet at Bridges, I listened for that hush. 6 years later, I met Hank in a Gallipolis diner. He watched the river and said he still heard tapping on steel, 3 beats, then 2. A college group borrowed my tape and returned it, saying wind made the rush beneath the thump. Yet on fog nights, when tires sounded muted on bridges, my teeth ached with remembered warmth. I kept my fuller account sealed and lived around it. I accepted that I had seen something that did not ask to be proved. In my desk drawer, Hank's gloves still smelled of rust and furnace breath for years afterward.